Hi, for today's video, I'll be demonstrating how to update a customer in Dynamics Finance and Operations using Advanco's Dynamics Adapter. This is an overview of the scenario I'll be demonstrating today, where we'll subscribe to a change event in Salesforce, and then that event will then trigger a message in CPI, which will then update the account in Microsoft Finance and Operations. One thing I do want to note is that it'll only give us a message for the field changed in Salesforce, so in CPI, we'll have to query for the remaining fields in Salesforce to update them in Microsoft Finance and Operations. The first thing we want to do is define our connection in Advanco's Dynamics Finance and Operations workbench. We do this by going into our workbench and putting in our specified credentials for these fields right here. As you can see, our user credential and client secret are going to be stored in our CPI tenant, as you can see right here. It makes it easier for when we create our iFlow, we can just look up our connection with the lookup key. Further, we can test our connection after we've created it. As you can see, our connection is successful. And then further in our workbench, we can also look up our schemas to create our mappings for this iFlow. For this scenario, I'll be using customer V2. So I'm going to go ahead and click on customer V2 and then generate a schema for it. And then after that schema is generated, we want to download the schema and upload it into our iFlow so we can create our message mapping. Next, after establishing our connection to Dynamics in our workbench, we want to create our iFlow for this scenario. As you can see, we have our sender being Salesforce.com, our message mapping, and then our receiver being Dynamics Finance and Operations. The first thing we want to do is define our connection to Salesforce, as I've done so right here. As we did it the same way with Dynamics Finance and Operations, we defined our connection to Salesforce with the lookup key in the workbench. Further, as we go further down, we have our subscription to our change event in Salesforce that's going to trigger our message. And then finally, we have our query to query for the rest of the data after the field in Salesforce is updated, in case we need that as well. Next, we want to create our message mapping for this scenario to ensure that our data is transferred properly and updated in Dynamics Finance and Operations. As you can see, I have the schema we generated earlier uploaded into CPI, as well as the custom query for the account schema here in Salesforce. So if we go in and open up our message mapping for this scenario, we can see how all this is structured and laid out. As you can see, here is our query for Salesforce.com, and then we have our parameters for our schema from Dynamics Finance and Operations. As you can see, we define each customer with a lookup. So as we go further down, we can understand the conditions and we see that the value is mapped to the SAP source ID. So this ensures that each customer that gets updated in Salesforce is going to be the exact same customer that it gets updated in Dynamics Finance and Operations because it is looked up with the SAP source ID.
Then, the last portion of setting up this iFlow is defining our connection to Dynamics Finance and Operations. As I mentioned earlier, we defined it in our workbench with the lookup key, so all we have to do when we define it in our CPI is go under connection and then define it by the lookup key and what we titled it as by, as you can see right here. Finally, the last thing to do is to test and see if our iFlow is working properly. To do this, I'm going to go into Salesforce and make a change in one of the fields. I'll make a change in the employee field for this scenario. So I will go ahead and change the employee field from 700 to 800 for Beck Sports. And you can see the SAP source ID right here as well. So I'm going to go ahead and save that change and then go into our finance and operations. So you see currently Beck Sports in our finance and operations tenant has 700 employees. However, if I go in and refresh the page and click on Beck Sports, we'll see we now have 800 employees. Further, I want to identify the account number that you see right here for the customer in Dynamics Finance and Operations is the exact same as the SAP source ID you see right here in Salesforce. Further, we can also test if our iFlow was successful by looking at our completed messages in CPI, as you can see right here. So I'll go in and look at our completed messages, and for this scenario, I actually did a trace, so we can go in and see what was sent at each step. So we can see from the message content in our sender Salesforce, we can see our payload, which is the query after our change event. And then we can further see right here, we have the schema for the query that we used for our message mapping. And then we have the end payload that gets transferred over into Dynamics Finance and Operations. As you can see, using Avanco's Dynamics adapter, it's quick and easy to integrate with Dynamics Finance and Operations.